course Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Ark Verma from Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. This week we have been talking about mental imagery. We have been focusing a lot upon visual imagery. In the last lecture we talked about the interrelationships between visual perception and visual imagery. We talked about the interrelation between auditory perception, auditory imagery, and so on and so forth. Now, the idea is that mental imagery is probably following a very similar process to which that we follow in visual perception, and we've across the last lecture, across the range of experimental studies that we've been following, we've tried to see this evidence experimentally that whether mental imagery or visual perception are actually working very closely together or not. I'll try and take you away from the mental imagery debate for a while, and I'm going to spend this lecture talking about something called cognitive maps. And cognitive maps is basically the aspect of mental imagery when you're actually talking more about the distance, when you're actually talking more about the navigational properties of the world that you're living in. What is situated next to what, how far are things from each other, what is the layout of a particular area or the building. Those are the kind of things we have we will be talking about here. So, what is a cognitive map? I am sure all of you at different points in time have been engaging in making these cognitive maps. Let me define them for you a little bit. A cognitive map is a mental representation of the environment that surrounds us. Okay. So, in general, if I ask you to make the map of let us say the map of the park near your home, or the map of the colony near where you're living, or let us say a map that takes you from your home to your workplace, that is basically you're actually plotting a complete layout of those areas. What are the shops in the middle, what are the roads that fall, whether you have to take a right turn or a left turn at a particular point, whether there is a curvy road. All of those kind of things need to be specified in this mental representation for this to be called a cognitive map, because this is what is going to lead you from place A to place B. So, in general, and it has been seen that our cognitive map represents areas that are too large to see in a single glance. So, if it were small objects, apples, bananas, those kind of things, you can actually look at them at at a single glance. You don't really need to have a map of those things. Say for example, you go to a departmental store. If you're looking at a very specific aisle, you're looking at a very specific shelf where, let us say, your favorite juice is stored, that's still okay. You can have a mental image of that thing, and when to take a particular brand of juice and come back, or things like that. But if I ask you to make a mental representation of that entire departmental store, an entire large store, then what you will need to indulge, or what you will need to make, is the cognitive map of the place. You will need to tell me that this is the entrance, and from the entrance, when you get in, on the left side is these trolleys that you take to shop, and on the right side you will find shelves wherein sweets are there. The other side there are shelves where vegetables are there. The other side at the left corner you will find say for example grocery like lentils and rice and those kind of things. So, then what I am drawing out of is my cognitive map of a particular place. So, this is pretty much what a cognitive map is. To deal with this large set of information, we create a cognitive map, and wherein we are creating a cognitive map by integrating information that we are acquiring from multiple consecutive views. So, we have been there so many times. Each time we've got a snapshot, we noted some information about this place. Next time you go again, you again get a snapshot, you again get some more information. You keep adding information with your each successive visit to this place. So, there are so many mental images, and you kind of collate all of them together to create a cognitive map of the entire departmental store. That is pretty much what we will be talking about today. Now, in general, the research on cognitive map emphasizes on the real world settings and ecological validity. It's basically talking about that cognitive maps, again, as we saw in the last lecture, basically work in very similar ways as our actual perception of maps would do. So, let's try and elaborate these things. Now, again, before I go into the experimental part of this, the study of cognitive maps, or mental imagery in that sense, basically comes under this broad field of interest called spatial cognition. What is spatial cognition? Again, I am not going to really get into the details of this, but let me try and define this for you a little bit. So, spatial cognition, basically it refers to our thoughts and about spatial issues. It not only includes cognitive maps, but also our knowledge of the world that we navigate in. You know, what is the distance of place A from place B, things like that. The world, the spatial arrangement of this place. So, you know, the shop, the coffee shop is situated left to the sweet shop, and the sweet shop is situated to the left of you know, the stationery shop. Those kind of arrangements, you have to really have all of these details about the spatial layout of the place that you're going to, you know, make a representation of in your cognitive map. Now, in psychology, spatial cognition has been it's been rather important. It has found a lot of mention in things like you know, environmental psychology, but generally spatial cognition is a field of interdisciplinary interest. And how is that happening? There are people, computer scientists, who have been trying to create models of our spatial knowledge. Suppose if you have to create a robot, and you have to actually ask the robot to navigate, let us say, a particular departmental store, and basically buy something that you've asked the robot to buy. So, again, the robot does not really have at its disposal all of the memory and all of the things that we have. So, the robot, you have to feed in every little detail in the robot, and people have found that, you know, it takes a lot of effort to make these artificial agents perform, even to match the kind of accuracy and the kind of sophisticated performance that human agents would do. Again, it just helps you appreciate the lot of minute details, a lot of minute processing that really goes on. Linguists have analyzed how people talk about spatial arrangements. Again, their issue is spatial cognition. Anthropologists study how different cultures use different frameworks to represent locations. Say, for example, Chinese you know, like to talk about space in a more vertical sense, as compared to Indians, we talk about the space in left to right kind of sense. Those kind of you know, cultural understandings of spatial cognition or space around us is also there. And there has, you will find something about spatial cognition in almost any field of interest. You will really, you know, you want to explore, and you want to read something about spatial cognition in. And this enormity of spatial cognition or spatial information that we actually deal with can be estimated by this very nice quote from Laszlo, and I am kind of borrowing this from the book of Matlin, and it says that it was discovered, and this is about when robots were basically being taught to you know, perform these spatial cognition tasks. So, it was discovered, much to the consternation of the programmers, that without exquisitely elaborate programs, you know, the program will have to have every little detail about every left right turn the you know, the robot has to take. Computers made unbelievably stupid errors. You know, they simply don't have the overall knowledge that we have. A simulation of a restaurant scene, for instance, might find the patrons entering by walking directly through the walls, whereupon they might see themselves on the floor, you know, things like that, and eventually tip the cook before leaving. To get this scene right, the programmer must supply the computer with an enormous amount of common sense information of the kind that makes you know, that makes up the basic cognitive map of a particular place. So, for example, if you are trying to teach the robot of how to go in a restaurant and behave, how do you come through the, you know, entrance, where do you seat yourself, where do you you know, position yourself, whatever different aspects you perform, and it is these very sophisticated details that you will have to teach the robot to really perform. So, yeah, this is fairly complex, and there is a lot of research in this area, and yeah, so we will be talking broadly about some of those kind of research in today's lecture. Even before I get into this, let me also again pin one of the basic topics here that I wanted to talk about. There has been a lot of talk about individual differences in various aspects of cognition, and those kind of things have been there. People have been found to be different in their spatial cognition skills. There has been some difference in their spatial abilities. So, although people would be you know, they will tend to be accurate in judging their ability to find their way through unfamiliar locations, Also, people have used things like metacognition about spatial ability, which have been found to be reasonably accurate, reasonably correct. Also, individual differences in spatial cognition have been found to be correlated with performance on a variety of spatial tasks. For example, if you remember the earlier task we were talking about in the last class as well, for example, people who were found good at the mental rotation task were found to be more skilled than the others in using a map to navigate somewhere, to go to a foreign country and use a map. So, people who have better mental imagery, who have been consistently performing better on tasks involving spatial ability, have also shown better ability in reading things like these maps. However, researchers have not really detailed the way, they have not really understood the way in which cognitive maps are encoded. That is sort of unclear. That is whether this code is propositional or analog. Now, though most of the researchers have opined that cognitive maps must be both analog and propositional in nature. For example, our mental map, if you are talking about the mental map of the city, now your mental map of the city will have the spatial layout, which is your spatial ability, but it will also have things, descriptions like I was talking about earlier. The McDonald's in X is in XYZ mall, which is next to this ABC office building. So, although you have the spatial arrangement right there in front of you, you would also have these descriptional notes attached to it, so that once you really want to find your way to that particular mall, you can use all of these verbal linguistic cues to make to basically ease your task through it. So, again there has been a lot of debate about whether imagery is analog or propositional. There seems to be a sense that cognitive maps basically involve both kind of representations. They basically are taking more information from both of these places. Now, I will just try and review some of the basic research related to cognitive maps, and then we will see what we find here. So, there has been a lot of research with respect to how people traverse distances in these cognitive maps. So, when people are making their estimates of distance using cognitive maps, their estimates have been often found to be distorted by factors such as the number of intervening cities between two places, the semantic categories the two things belong to, or also whether the particular destination they are traveling to is a very important landmark destination, or it is a kind of a mundane non-landmark destination. We will talk about this now. So, number of intervening studies. In one of the first systematic studies about distance traversing in cognitive maps, Thorndike back in 1981 constructed a map of a hypothetical place, a hypothetical region, wherein the cities were distributed throughout the map. And what Thorndike asked participants to do was basically estimate the time that would be taken to travel from point A to point B. And the distance between the two cities could be filled up by 1 cities, 2 cities, or 3 cities, or almost there will be no cities in some cases. Participants, they studied this map, they till they could accurately reconstruct it almost. So, they have completely memorized it, and then they were making these estimates of the distances between a given pair of cities. The number of intervening cities had clearly an influence on their estimates of distance. For example, when a particular pair of cities was 300 miles apart on the map, people estimated that they were just 280 miles apart, because there were no intervening cities between these two things. So, their estimate is getting shrunk because there is no intervening cities between the two cities that are in question. In contrast, when the two target cities are separated by 1 or 2 or 3 of intervening cities, their judgment actually shot up to 350 miles. So, the idea is their judgment is kind of getting inflated by then when there are more number of intervening cities. Variations have also been conducted of this study, and where people have confirmed that a distance seems longer when the route is calculated, when the route is cluttered with so many objects. If there are too many landmarks in the middle or too many important things in the middle, the distance estimation kind of goes awry. Also, when the road features a number of complex turns rather than a straight route. Okay. So, again this was about distance. The other aspect is about semantic categories. So, research has shown that semantic factors also influence people's estimates of distance when they are talking about or when they are traversing a cognitive map. So, things like Hertel and Mascolo in 1986 they actually did this experiment. They showed participants a hypothetical map of a town, much like the earlier study, and they asked these participants to memorize the locations on this map. The map then the map was removed and the people were asked to estimate the distance between two locations, any two locations on the map. The results showed that people tended to shift location to other sites that belonged to locations close to other sites that belonged in the same semantic cluster. Say for example, a courtroom was estimated to be much closer to a police station because semantically they form the same group. In contrast, they did not move the courtroom closer to a golf course because again these two are very different things. So, again this research says that if two things are semantically close together in your head, your estimate of distance about them is also probably kind of getting shrunk. Similar results were also reported when the students of University of Michigan estimated distances between pairs of locations on the campus or outside the campus. In summary, these studies confirm an additional distortion in distance estimates, that is, when two places belong to the same semantic category, we might judge them to be closer together. Again, these are sort of findings, again experimentally proved. You can see where all you are using them in your daily lives, etc. Another very interesting incident, and this is why I was referring to linking this with your daily life. You might have come across a situation where when you are actually going to a very coveted place, you are going to this famous mall or this particular tourist town. The distance when you are traveling towards this tourist town always seems to be lesser as compared to when you are traveling from this important location to a slightly non-important location. This is pretty much what is referred to as the landmark effect, that is the general tendency to provide shorter estimates of time when traveling towards a landmark rather than towards a non-landmark. This is the classic landmark effect, and McNamara and Rivadkar basically did this study in 1997. They asked students to again memorize a map with various pictures of objects. This map included some objects that were designated as landmarks, some other objects that were designated as non-landmarks. After learning the locations, the students were to estimate the distances of these things on the map between various pairs of objects. Consistent with the landmark effect, the students showed asymmetry in their distance estimates. For example, if you are traveling towards a particular landmark, the estimate of distance was only about 1.4 inches, and when traveling from the non-landmark to landmark, so when they are traveling towards the landmark, the distance was shortened. It was made up to 1.4 inches. When they are traveling away from that landmark to something else, the distance was stretched to 1.7 inches. So, they are overestimating the distance when they are traveling away from the landmark to some other non-landmark place, and they are shortening the distance estimate when they are actually traveling towards a particular landmark. Again, this could be affected by so many different factors, by expectations, by overall motivation to go to that place, and those kind of things. But we see that this is kind of entering your estimate of distance, entering how you navigate with your cognitive map. So, this is again one aspect of research. There has also been some research regarding cognitive maps and shape. So, shapes are very important features in cognitive maps, as the angles performed by these intersecting streets and the curves, they illustrate these bendings of rivers, and those kind of things are also they are very important information that you would like to maintain. Now, research suggests that there is also another systematic distortion. We tend to construct maps in which shapes are much more regular than they actually are. And say for example, angles. In a classic study by Mower and Bower in 1983, they wanted to study the cognitive maps of people for the place Cambridge in England. So, all the participants had lived in Cambridge for at least 5 years, and they wanted to determine people's estimates for the angles found by the intersection of particular two streets. They found out that the participants were showing a clear tendency to regularize the angles so that they are more similar to the 90-degree angle. For example, for 3 intersections in Cambridge, where the real angles were around 67, 63 and 50 degrees, participants basically gave the estimates of 84, 87 and 88 degrees, 84, 78 and 88 degrees. So, the idea is they are kind of pushing these estimates more towards the 90 degree, because 90 degree is almost the perfect intersection. So, the idea is they are kind of regularizing and standardizing whatever you are seeing. See, in the ideal world, everything is not so perfectly geometrical, but you are seeing this is one of the biases that we have. When you ask somebody to describe a particular turn, a particular intersection, they are actually doing this almost unknowingly in some sense. So, Mower and Bower suggested that people are employing what is called the 90-degree angle heuristic, that is, they represent angles in a mental map as being as close to 90 degrees than they really are. Other research, let's talk about other research. Research also suggests that people tend to use what is called a symmetry heuristic. That is, they remember figures as being more symmetrical than they actually are. So, these results follow the general pattern. The small inconsistencies of geographical reality are smoothed over, creating cognitive maps that are much more ideal and much more standardized. Let me take an example. So, they did this study wherein they were supposed to estimate shapes of particular place, and they actually imagined those shapes to be very regularized and very standard. Also, there has been research about cognitive maps and relative position. So, for example, Tversky did this research, and it points out that we are using these heuristics when we are also representing relative positions of objects in our cognitive map. Things like, just as we are using heuristics about 90-degree angle or symmetrical heuristic, we are using all of these heuristics to also understand relative position of objects. Tversky argues that we remember a tilted geographical structure, something that is slanted, as being either more vertical or more horizontal. This is called the rotation heuristic. Also, he says that we remember geographical structures as being arranged in much straighter line than they actually are. Let us take some examples about this. So, according to the rotation heuristic, a figure that is slightly tilted will be remembered as either more vertical or more horizontal. So, when Tversky in 1991 they studied people's mental maps for the geographical region of San Francisco's Bay Area, she found that almost 69% of the students at a Bay Area university showed the evidence for the rotation heuristic. According to the alignment heuristic, a series of geographical structures should be remembered as being much more lined up with each other as than they really are. So, they did this experiment Tversky in 1981. They presented pairs of cities to students who were asked to actually tell which of them is more towards the north. So, they gave, for example, Rome and Philadelphia. Now, the problem with Rome and Philadelphia is north of Europe, Philadelphia is in the south of the United States, so, actually Rome is in the southern part of Europe and Philadelphia is in the northern part of Europe. Now, what people do is they try and align Europe and US in such a way that they are lying on the same latitude, and what results is that in this kind of description, people conclude incorrectly that Philadelphia is in north of Rome, because Rome is in the southern part of Europe, Philadelphia is in the northern part of US. So, if you are imagining them as aligned to each other, you will think that Philadelphia is in northern and Rome is southern, while where in actuality you can see the figure here, Rome is actually slightly towards the north as compared to Philadelphia. Again, this is an evidence for people aligning the two locations close to each other. So, Tversky's results indicated that many students are showing this consistent tendency to use the alignment heuristic. For example, 78% judged PA to be northern of much north of Rome as compared to only 12% judging them at the same. Only 10% of these people actually gave the correct decision. So, this is all from me about cognitive maps. I hope you understood a lot of facts about this, and let us meet in the next section.